Joanna grew up surrounded by silk, full bowls, and measured words. She lived in Tiberias, a city with the smell of fresh fish and dirty politics, where conversations were full of interests and silence was worth more than any promise. Married to Cusa, an important man in the court of Herod Antipas, she saw the world from above. On the outside, Joanna was the picture of success. Well-dressed, well-married, respected. On the inside, it was a different story. She carried a suffering that the doctors couldn't name, and no one in the palace dared comment on. There were days when her body was heavy, her mind was spinning, and her soul seemed to be chained to something invisible. You could see it in her eyes, that tired gleam of someone who has tried everything. It was like living in a castle with a cracked roof and no one listening. And to make matters worse, living there was like walking on eggs. Herod was not an easy man. Any misstep could cost him more than a job. It could cost him his head. Joan learned early on to smile with her mouth and keep quiet with her heart. She watched, she listened, she swallowed. But there was something inside her that wouldn't go away. A stubborn, almost annoying hope that whispered, "It's not over yet." Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with a financial aid by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. That's when the rumors started to come in. Stories of a Jesus, a simple man who healed the sick, spoke with authority and ate with sinners. People walking again, others seeing again, some even changing their lives. She listened in silence, first with suspicion, then with curiosity, and finally with desire. It wasn't just healing she was looking for. It was freedom, and it was this desire, this whisper inside her that made her leave for the first time without looking back. Joanna didn't know what to expect when she decided to set off on the road to Capernaum. It was almost on impulse. She dressed discreetly, hid her face with her veil, and went out before the sun rose high. She didn't tell anyone. Deep down, she knew that if she thought about it too much, she would end up giving up. But something stronger than fear pulled her forward, as if her heart knew the way before her head did. In the midst of the cramped crowd, she saw him, Jesus. He didn't look like a king, nor did he have the bearing of a priest. But when he spoke, it was as if each word cut through the air and landed straight in the soul. He was different. He didn't shout. He didn't make empty promises. He spoke of a kingdom, but it wasn't the kind of kingdom she knew. It was a different kind of government, where the last were first and where tears didn't flow for nothing. She approached, half pushed by the crowd, half guided by something invisible. And when she got close enough to really see him, it wasn't his face that caught her attention, but his gaze, a look that seemed to cross time, as if it knew exactly what she had experienced, what she felt, what she was hiding. Joanna didn't have to explain. She didn't have to tell her story or name the pain that accompanied her. Jesus simply saw her for real, and that was enough. With a word from him, something inside her that had been locked away opened up. The body eased, as if a chain had been broken, but it was in her soul that the deepest healing took place. She came home different. There was no hiding it. Even she couldn't explain it. What used to weigh her down now seemed light. What used to hurt was now just a scar. But along with the lightness came a restlessness. How could she go on living in the palace, knowing that there was something bigger going on outside? In the days that followed, Joanna tried to get back into her old routine, but it was like putting on shoes that no longer fit. The palace walls, which had once given her security, now seemed too narrow. The conversations about politics, the calculated glances, the forced smiles, all that had lost its flavor. Life there continued to revolve to the same rhythm, but she no longer belonged to that dance. At dawn, while Cusa was still asleep, she looked out of the window at the dark sky and wondered what Jesus was doing at that time. Was he still in Galilee? Was he still healing people, speaking to crowds, walking through small villages with that unsettling peace? She missed something she couldn't even name. Until the day came when Joanna couldn't pretend any longer. She grabbed some simple clothes, discreetly saved a few coins, and left. There was no dramatic scene, no speech, just a silence full of certainty. She left behind the comfort, the banquets, the echo-filled corridors, and for the first time she stepped barefoot onto the dirt road. Journeys with Jesus had no map. The ground was dry, the sun merciless, and sleep came on thin mats under the stars. But there was a new lightness in her steps. In each village, she saw people's faces light up as they listened to those words of life. It was like watching the impossible happen before her eyes. Not just healings in the body, but hearts that began to beat again. Joan became one of many who followed Jesus. She was not alone. Other women had also given up everything. Mary Magdalene, healed of torments that no one understood. Susanna, generous and steadfast. They shared what they had, helped with the needs of the group, looked after each other. But what few people knew was that it was they, in silence, who kept that ministry going. While the men led the way, preaching, healing, and facing suspicious looks from the Pharisees, Joanna and the other women were a little further back. But they weren't in the background. They carried bags of groceries, took care of the details that nobody saw, cooked meals, cared for the sick, offered shelter when they could. And more than that, they financed the journey. Joanna knew how to handle money. Living with Cusa for years had taught her more than table manners and small talk. She knew how to negotiate, she knew where to get support, she knew where to cut and where to multiply. It was as if God had used even the years inside the palace to prepare her for this moment. Everything made sense now. The coins that once bought expensive perfumes now bought bread for the hungry. The hands that once embroidered fine fabrics were now cleaning wounds. But the most curious thing was to see how Jesus treated each one of them. Not as servants, not as sidekicks. He listened to them, called them by name, drew them close. At a time when women could hardly even learn the law, there they were learning directly from the Master. And there was no charity about it. There was respect, equality, value. Joanna remembered well when they heard one muggy afternoon, that strange teaching about turning the other cheek, about loving your enemies, about forgiving more times than you can count. It wasn't just beautiful, it was a challenge, because to follow Jesus was also to fight against pride, against haste, against the impulse to return to one's comfort zone. The road was not easy. There were threats in the air. With each town, there was more tension. The religious leaders were already upset. The name of Jesus was spreading, and not everyone saw it in a good light. Joanna could see it in his eyes. Something was coming, something big and dangerous. Joanna couldn't tell how long they had been on the road when everything began to change. The atmosphere became heavier. The conversations became whisperier. Some of the disciples became suspicious of each other, and Jesus, he remained firm, but his eyes bore a different kind of weariness. Not physical, but that of someone who sees the end approaching and knows that no one is ready. Jerusalem was the destination. The city seemed to breathe danger. They entered it as if they were entering a minefield. Joanna felt it in the air. Every corner, every strange face, every standing soldier seemed like a mute warning. Yet Jesus walked without hesitation. He spoke of the cross with a naturalness that hurt. And no matter how hard the women tried to maintain their routine, something inside them already knew the storm was about to break. And it did. From one day to the next, what was a crowd turned into a trial. What was applause became spit. What was hope became a cry of hate. They arrested Jesus as if he were a criminal. They humiliated, beat, and dragged him through the streets as if everything he had done was wrong. Joan watched from afar, her chest in pieces, unable to do anything. The whole world seemed to have turned its back. The crucifixion was a waking nightmare. She was there, She saw the nails, heard the silence between the screams, felt the earth shake. And when everything finally stopped, emptiness took over. They put his body in a borrowed tomb, and the stone was rolled away as if to erase it all at once. But Joanna knew there was no forgetting. She couldn't go on as if nothing had happened. Saturday came slowly, dragging on. A day when nothing could be done. But wait. My hands itched to act, my heart begged for answers, but the sky was silent. And in the midst of this silence, Joanna could only think of one thing. What would happen when that sun finally rose again? The sun hadn't even risen when Joanna got up. The streets were cold, quiet, with that strange silence at dawn that seems to hold the world's breath. She hurried out, her eyes heavy from the night's sleep and her hands clutching the perfumes and oils she had carefully prepared. It was the last gesture of love she could offer. To honor Jesus' body, to care for him as no one else would. Mary Magdalene and a few other women were with her. None of them said a word. Every step on the road to the tomb was a mixture of longing, fear, and a pain so deep that no tears came out. They knew where he had been buried. They had seen everything. They knew about the stone, the sealed entrance, the soldiers on guard, and they still went, because sometimes love goes even when reason tells it to stop. But when they got there, something was wrong. The stone, that huge stone, was rolled aside. The tomb was open. Joanna's heart pounded in her chest as if she wanted to run out of there. She walked in slowly, her eyes trying to get used to the darkness. And then, emptiness. The body wasn't there. Before despair could take hold, something flashed inside the tomb. Two men in clothes that looked like light. The women froze. One of the figures spoke in a firm but serene voice. "Why are you looking for the living among the dead?" The air disappeared. Joanna felt a chill run down her spine. What did that mean? Alive. What did it mean? The angel, if he was indeed an angel, continued. "He's not here. He's risen." The words echoed inside her like thunder. She looked at the others. No one knew what to do, but their feet began to run before they could even think. They needed to tell. They needed to warn the disciples. And deep down, Joanna knew no one would believe her. Joanna ran like she had never run before in her life. Her heart felt like it was going to tear out of her chest, not just because of the effort, but because of the avalanche of feelings that overwhelmed her thoughts. The angel's words were still hammering inside her. She was resurrected. It was too big, too strong, almost impossible to believe, and yet she knew it was true. They arrived panting where the disciples were hiding. They knocked on the door as if the house were on fire. When they opened it, their faces were haggard, their eyes deep, their hope still buried with Jesus. Joanna spoke first. She told them everything: the empty tomb, the rolled stone, the angel, the words. He lives. He's alive. But what she saw in their eyes wasn't joy. It was doubt. Peter frowned. Thomas crossed his arms. Some shook their heads as if listening to a beautiful but illogical story. A woman talking about resurrection. It was too much to digest. They wanted proof, not words. They wanted to see it with their own eyes, touch it with their own hands. Joanna insisted. She repeated every detail, but disbelief seemed stronger than the truth. Even so, she kept quiet. She told anyone who would listen, and even those who wouldn't. Deep down, it didn't matter whether they believed her or not. She knew what she had seen, what she had felt, and no one could take that away from her. In the days that followed, Joanna stood firm. She knew that something was moving. It was as if the world was about to turn upside down, and while her disciples tried to pick up the pieces of what they had experienced, she began to look forward. There was no going back. Not after that. What Joanna still didn't know was where that road would take her now. If Jesus was alive, then the call was still alive too. And the world, as scary as it was full of places where the truth still needed to reach. Time passed, but Joanna didn't stand still. While many were still trying to understand what had happened, she was already on the move. The news of the resurrection wasn't just a revelation. It was a call. Something inside her told her that this was just the beginning. The world needed to know, and she knew how to walk through it. She knew how to enter places where few had a voice. She knew how to talk to people from all walks of life. And most of all, she knew what it was like to have her life truly transformed. Some say she went to Rome. Others say she passed through big cities and forgotten villages. The truth is that wherever she went, Joan didn't just carry memories, she carried testimony. She didn't talk about a Jesus she had heard about, but one who looked into her eyes, who healed her wounds, who called her to walk with him, and who conquered death. She knew what it was like to be ignored. She knew what it was like to be a woman in a world that silenced female voices. Even so, she spoke out, firmly, with detail, with passion. And even when people laughed, even when they looked at her sideways, she didn't back down. Because deep down, she had faced worse. And surviving the silence of Saturday made her face any mockery with her head held high. Joanna took the same care with her as before. She helped out however she could. She supported those who had little. She looked after the sick. She was a kind of bridge between what was and what could be. And as she walked, more people joined her. Curious people, hurt people, people looking for a fresh start. And she told them. She told how it all began, what it was like before, how the meeting went, and how everything changed afterwards. But the further she walked, the more the shadow of empire grew. The faith was spreading, yes, but the eyes of Rome were beginning to turn towards it too. Over time, the names you heard in conversation were almost always the same. Peter, John, James, Paul, strong voices, leaders who carried crowds and faced imprisonment. But Joan's name, that disappeared into the folds of history. It was as if she had suddenly disappeared, as if her voice had fallen silent. But make no mistake, silence is not always oblivion. Sometimes it's just the most discreet way of remaining. Because even without the spotlight, Joanna continued, in the shadows, behind the scenes, in the narrow corridors where faith was whispered for fear of the soldiers, there she was, teaching, caring, sharing. None of this needed an audience, and that in itself was a kind of resistance. People might not remember her, but you only had to look closely to see her imprint in the smallest gestures, in the firmness with which a new convert told of her faith, in the bread that arrived on the doorstep of those who had nothing, in the courage of a woman who refused to back down in the face of a threat Joanna had planted. And even if no one said it out loud, the fruit was there. It was ironic. She, who had once walked among the powerful, was now part of a faith that power wanted to destroy. The empire didn't like that message. The idea of a crucified and risen king was too uncomfortable. They started watching, arresting, erasing names. And among those names there were many that nobody knew, people like Joanna, people who didn't want to be applauded, but without whom much would have fallen apart. The letters Paul wrote crossed continents. The apostles kept preaching. But in the midst of it all, someone had to continue to be there, on the ground of life, looking after the base. And Joanna did that. While official history walked the great roads, she walked the smaller streets. And it was there, in those forgotten corners, that her story lived on, even when the end began to approach. Nobody knows for sure when Joanna left. No record, no tombstone, no exact account, as if the last chapter of her life had been kept only in heaven. But perhaps that's because her end was never what really mattered. What remains of Joanna is neither a date nor a statue. It's a trail. She followed it as far as she could. Her feet were tired, yes, but her heart was burning. She grew old like a tree, with deep roots, wide shade, and sweet fruit. She was remembered in small meetings, in prayers said quietly, in advice passed between women like a golden thread hidden between the fingers. No one announced her loudly, but many walked because of what she had sown. Perhaps she died in peace, surrounded by people who once healed, who once hugged, who once heard from her that Jesus was alive. Or maybe she left alone, in a corner, like so many others who gave their lives without the world noticing. But it doesn't matter, because she herself knew her name was written where it mattered most. And even now, so many centuries later, you can hear her voice echoing if you pay attention. When a woman stands up to serve, even without recognition, when someone insists on loving, even if they are disbelieved, when someone uses everything they have, not for themselves, but for others, there Joan is, alive again. Her story hasn't been erased, it just changed shape. She became an example, she became a route, she became a bridge. And perhaps at the end of the day, Joan's greatest legacy is this, to show that sometimes those who seem small are the ones who bring about the greatest transformations. Looking back, you can see that Joanna wasn't just a passing character in Jesus' story. She was a living part of the journey. She didn't carry a title, a pulpit, or fame, but she carried faith, courage, and a commitment that didn't make a sound. It made a difference. And perhaps this is precisely where the beauty of her story lies, in the simple way she lived something so great. Joanna teaches us that service is not about a stage, but about purpose. That true strength often comes from the place of pain. She was a woman in a time when women were barely allowed to speak, and yet she did. She was rich in a world where wealth was used to climb, and she used hers to support what came from God. She traded comfort for mission and never looked back. And look how that speaks to us. Because today, in times when everything seems to go too fast and we're pressured to show results, win titles, prove our worth, Joan's story whispers another logic in our ear. The logic of the kingdom, where those who serve are great, where what is done in hiding does not go unnoticed by God. She didn't wait to be ready. She didn't wait to be recognized. She just heard the call and said yes. And that yes echoes to this day, in our difficult days, in our doubts, in the desire to give up. Joanna is that silent reminder that it's worth continuing, that every gesture of faith, every step of courage, every renunciation for love, all this builds something eternal. So, when we ask ourselves if it's making a difference, if it's worth going on even without applause, even without an immediate response, maybe we just need to remember her. Joanna, an ordinary woman with a real calling, who chose the most difficult path and left marks that time has not been able to erase. If you like Joanna's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.